Okay, I'm going to get started now, if that's all right. So welcome everyone to Open Democracy's weekly live discussion. My name is Nandini Archer, and I work on the Tracking the Backlash team at Open Democracy, which is a feminist investigative journalism project. And today I am chairing this panel. So we have some really great guests for you all, and of course, a very important topic. So welcome to everyone joining today. We do want this conversation to involve as many of you as possible. So thank you to all of those who already submitted their questions and comments ahead of time. So I'm going to try and address as many of them as possible, because I have loads and loads of questions here from you. So thank you so much. And to the panelists, though, you really don't have to wait for me to ask you something. Please do feel free to butt in and share your thoughts at any moment, if you want to expand or respond to something that another panelist says, for instance. So to the audience, if you're joining on Zoom and you have a question or comment for us, please do click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen and type into that chat window. And people who are watching on Facebook right now can put their questions in comments there, and my colleague will share those with me. So this week's topic, without further ado, is how the Taliban took back Afghanistan. So after 20 years of NATO occupation, the Taliban were able to retake Afghanistan in a matter of days. So what happened, and what should Western states learn? And today we have with us Paul Rogers, who's a professor of peace studies at Bradford University. We have Dr. Harmonie Toros, who works at the University of Kent on international conflict analysis. And we also have Clive Lewis, who's Labour MP from Norwich South, who served as a soldier in Afghanistan. And finally, we have Hammasa Kohistani, who is a digital content creator and spokesperson for a leading fashion and beauty brand, and an advocate for refugee women, working closely with the Roshan Foundation. So without further ado, to kick us off, Hammasa, I've got two parts to this initial question, I think, to get us started. What is the feeling on the ground right now in Afghanistan, as far as you know? And what's the feeling among the Afghan diaspora?
I mean, it's very difficult for me to verbalize what we're feeling being far away and watching what's going on. But I am continuously sent videos, footage, pictures, voice notes that family are sending to each other. And it is absolutely awful. What the news is showing is only the tip of the iceberg of what's actually going on the ground and what people are what's happening to our people. There is small provinces. There is already public floggings of women has started. They're shooting at people. They've taken some girls from the smaller villages in Herat and Kandahar. So everything that our people feared in Afghanistan is already happening. And it's been a few days. So when people say to try and keep an open mind or possibly legitimize Taliban as the government, it's literally our worst nightmare, because like I said, what the news is showing is very limited to what's actually going on the ground. And the sentiment around the world of Afghans around the world, we're heartbroken. We feel completely helpless. There is nothing that we can do. We have immense survivor's guilt. All we can do is talk about it and share it. And it's so upsetting because we've been sharing this for a long time and we felt like the whole world ignored us. And now again, we're screaming at top of our lungs, telling the people that the Taliban have not changed. This whole narrative of this reborn Taliban 2.0 is all part of the propaganda. And they haven't changed. And again, our voices are falling on deaf ears. So we are very, very heartbroken, and there's nothing we can do about it.
Thank you, Hammasa. And next to Clive, according to many people who live in Afghanistan, or those people who are following what's happening there, a lot of people have said that the Taliban seemed kind of inevitable at this point, but a lot of the international community and international press seem shocked. Why do you think that is the case?
I imagine they've been shocked, partly because there's a sense of, if you want, Western infallibility when it comes to, despite recent history. I think there's been complete shock for many commentators and the public, and one's led to believe, politicians, that this collapse happened so quickly. And I think many commentators haven't been paying attention to what's been going on. They're coming to the party late, so to speak, haven't been following what's been happening about, the way that things have been unfolding. And they're coming to this now, and then there's a sense of shock. So I think that's part of the reason why people are finding themselves in the situation they're in. I think, as Hammasa was saying before, if you've been listening to the Afghan, to the Afghan community, you would have known this. I wrote a recent article for The Guardian about the betrayal of Afghan interpreters who've been working with the British and with armed forces from across NATO, and the absolute betrayal that's taken place of them. And one of the things that people don't understand that the interpreters did for us in Afghanistan on the ground wasn't didn't just translate words. They translated context. They helped us to see a broader picture. And I really do feel if we've been listening to the Afghan people a little bit more closely, we would have had a much better picture. But instead, this government here, I don't mean to make this party political, but this government hasn't been listening. In fact, when it comes to interpreters and others who've been applying for visas for years to get into this country, they've been rejected. They've faced a hostile environment, despite the fact we've been in that country, involved in that country for 20 years. So I'm not surprised at their shock. And, I've been doing the media rounds as well. You so often hear in the line of questioning that people ask a kind of editorialization that takes place in the very questions they ask you about certain assumptions. We were there for liberal Western values and other kind of tropes that come out, which just kind of belies a lack of intellectual rigor when it comes to what's been happening in the past 20 years, which I'm sure we can begin to unpack as we go through this discussion.
Thank you so much, Clive. And so next to Harmonie, this was a question from the audience. Actually, it's two questions really from one person. Number one, why did the war last so long? And number two, put simply, who do you think is to blame for what's happening right now?
Two hard questions. I think there's a series of problems that come together here, and probably the way that I would unpack it to start with is that there were two, or a variety, but two clear and contradicting drivers to the war in Afghanistan and the violence in Afghanistan, which was, on one side, there was very clear Western interests and great power interests of controlling the country for counterterrorism operations, and with this idea that international security was going to be strengthened or improved if the Taliban left, if there was a change of regime, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a very, very strong counterterrorism narrative that drives a lot of the actions of the United States and allies in Afghanistan. And then on the other side, you have this idea of state building, and the two don't combine. And I think we can finally come to this conclusion that if great powers are going to be pursuing their specific interests and try and do this in as short term as possible and as quickly as possible, that does not combine with long-term state building. On top of this, you have the problem that there is a confusion between state building and peace building, and an assumption that state building is peace building, right? So there is this tendency, and this is not only in Afghanistan, but it's an international blueprint that keeps on coming up, of building these empty shells of states. And then all of a sudden, once the backing of weapons, the backing of money, the backing of troops on the ground is pulled out, everyone is all of a sudden surprised that the empty shell of the state doesn't survive it. So I think there's these two issues come to a fore here, and I hate to think of lessons learned for the West based on people dying and people's livelihoods and lives being lost, because I always have trouble with that. The idea that hundreds and thousands of people die and then we learn a lesson, right? I find it a terrible mismatch in such a variety of ways. But at the same time, if there are no lessons learned, then that is even a greater crime in a certain sense, right?
Great, thank you. Okay then, and Paul, we had some questions for you. specifically on a recent op-ed that you wrote that said the West's defeat in Afghanistan will inspire extremists and please China. So for those joining us today, could you explain why this is the case? Oh, I think you're on mute.
My apologies. If you go right back to 9/11 itself, then in the United States, you had this very strong view that you had to address the reasons, and the reasons, as far as they could see, were Al-Qaeda. If you turn the whole thing round at that time, you could argue that Al-Qaeda itself was more interested in staging the attack for two reasons. One, to incite support across the world, and two, to draw the United States and any other allies into a kind of trap. And they were looking back to the defeat of the Soviet Union by the Mujahideen back in the 1980s. And in a sense, I think you may see a repeat of that to some extent. And that is that you will find some of the groups around the world, not necessarily just ones relating to Islam, will actually see this as a defeat for the West, particularly for the United States. And it will give them, I would even use the term, a degree of inspiration. I think we had to face up to that because obviously you have a major problem worldwide which goes way beyond our current conversation in terms of what are going to be the major determinants of international insecurity. And it's clear that it is not going to be state-on-state conflict. It's other huge things like climate breakdown. And in those circumstances, we have more and more people on the margins knowing it, but in considerable difficulty, in a sense that any kind of action which seems to limit the view, the picture of the world's elite is regarded as good. So in that broad sense, I can see you have that impact. As to China itself, well, Taliban, quite a senior delegation, was invited to China 4 weeks ago to talk to the Chinese foreign minister and to engage with officials over some days. And as far as I can see, remember also that you do have the Wuhan corridor, which goes straight through to China. The border is not passable for much of the winter, but it will be possible to have a direct road and possibly even in due course a rail connection. I think China, in a way, sees an increased role in Afghanistan as having its own advantages. One, it could ensure, it can insist that any Taliban regime with which it does business was willing to control, if you like, the Uyghur paramilitaries within its ranks who've been operating in support of their kindred in Xinjiang in Western China. But two, it would give China an opening up to another part of Western Asia and possibly access to the very strong mineral reserves. So I think from the Chinese perspective, this is an opportunity to play a major role in the development of that part of West Central Asia. It applies to some extent to the Pakistanis. The Iranians are much more cautious at present. The Russians obviously would like some sort of stake in it. But the reality, which becomes very harsh given the nature of the Taliban regime, is there are countries in the region who are prepared to do business, and I stress the word business, with them. And I don't see that easily being prevented.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to move on as well to the issue of women's rights, because we, of course, had a lot of questions and comments from the audience on that. So, Hammasa, you already touched on this. Women have been the center of the discussion in recent weeks. So as an Afghan woman, how would you describe the prospect of living under the Taliban? And then as a second part to this question, a lot of people have asked, how would you describe life for women under the 20 years of occupation as well?
So I don't know if you guys have seen their latest statement, the Taliban's, but they've actually asked all the women to stay home and not come to work for their safety, supposedly, because soldiers are disrespectful towards them. That's what they're selling to the people. So it's already started. Women are not allowed to go to work. Kids are not allowed to go to school, female students, that is. And it's absolute nightmare. Bear in mind, majority of these little girls who are young ladies now have seen their moms get lashed, beaten, and just destroyed in the last Taliban regime. So the fear of that is what first consumed people before the Taliban arrived in Kabul, and now they're seeing their worst nightmares coming true. So I can't even stress enough how inhumane they treat especially women and girls. And, the child marriages and the sex slaves is a whole different argument. Like, we know what's going on. Everything that you guys discussed just now, I know that in the West, it's all very, there are things involved, and how it's said across, or how it's communicated has to be worded a certain way. But in Afghanistan, everything's very simple. The people are very simple. We know what's going on. We know how many countries are interested in our minerals and what we provide. We know all the business dealings. To the people of Afghanistan, it's very simple to see. And it's just as simple to see what the Taliban are going to do to our women. So this is not just this generation, but the next 2-3 generations of young women have gone now. They're destroyed. And it's going to take a long time for that to be, for that fear to be gone and for the country to rebuild. It's 60% of the population. There's 40% of the population under 14, as in any developing country. And that's 40% of the population that will not have a future or a life. So I think our main concern now, the Afghans who are in the West, is just to try and get the best we can for the women and girls, the protection that they need. And I think the international communities need to come together and have some sort of leverage and do something about this. It's just not human, it's barbaric.
Thank you. Do any of the other panelists have any other thoughts on this issue of women's rights before we move on?
Hammasa, is it possible to say anything about what the situation has been within Afghanistan over the last 10 or 15 years and how that might impact on what happens next?
The last 10, 15 years had given people hope in Afghanistan. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't this. For us, we've had so many people come and invade our country for so many decades, and the Taliban by far were the worst regime. So anything other than the Taliban, the people would be happy with, or at least could tolerate. So although the West was there and they were causing their own atrocities in their own ways, it still gave a generation of young people hope, and they fought for their rights, and they managed to get jobs. There were shows such as the Afghan Voice, and there was entertainment, and they were artists, they were comedians. So while the coalition governments were involved and were in Afghanistan, it kind of gave people a slight taste of what it could be like. And that's why it's so hard for our people to accept what's going on now, because it's like we teased them with a taste of freedom and then took it all away. So it's like if you never knew about it, you could probably bear this more. But when you've had a taste of freedom, you've gone to school, you've had hopes and dreams and goals, like the Afghan robotics team, the girls who created simple ventilators out of car parts for COVID. And they were using that in Afghanistan. It's a team of 15, 16-year-old girls. Like, what's going to happen to all of those people now? So they were able to do that while the US and UK were involved in Afghanistan. So that's why it's so crushing for them.
Nandini, can I ask a question if that's possible?
Yeah, of course.
Can I ask, is there a sense that there was a delineation between the metropolitan areas, often where the NGOs, the government, the international community aid, the military missions, the employment took place, and therefore where women's rights were in a far better place, and then the insurgency the fighting that was taking place more or less outside of them in the rural countryside, where we know the drone attacks and many of the bombings and special force operations and so on, where the actual conflict was taking place in particular. Is there a sense that it was a tale of kind of two communities, of one in the rural areas and one in the cities? Is that a fair assessment of looking at? Because I'm kind of thinking to myself, I've been reading some stuff about the sheer scale of the bombings and the drone attacks. We now know from the leaked documents that 90% of those who were killed in the drone program, the US drone program, which has seen thousands of tons of munitions dropped on individuals, 90% of them were innocent bystanders. I'm just wondering whether there are kind of two different kind of viewpoints here, from those who are tired of the occupation, the Allied occupation, in Afghanistan and those in the cities who had a different experience of it. Is that something you can perhaps you can comment on?
I think the way the people of Afghanistan see what's going on in Afghanistan right now, they see this as an invasion. So we've had one invaders go and others come in. So this isn't what they wanted. I mean, they may have been tired of the US invasion, possibly, but it doesn't mean that they then wanted them to be replaced by another country's invasion, a proxy war. So this isn't a civil matter for us. No Afghan that you would ask in Afghanistan believes that this is a civil conflict. So how is this improving the situation of those rural areas? It's still the same thing.
Can I ask, are the Taliban themselves commonly regarded as Afghans, or to what extent are they seen as outsiders?
I believe probably 80. I mean, there are some supporters, as there always will be, of course. But I believe that 80% of Afghans believe that Taliban are not Afghan, or nor are they being governed by Afghans. So the sentiment across Afghanistan is that Taliban, we don't count the Taliban as Afghans. Some of them don't even speak our languages. So they're not Afghan. And if you look at a famous celebrity, in fact, just got out on the first plane in the, she was interviewed by the BBC and CNN. She's like the biggest Afghan celebrity, and she managed to escape in the first plane. She was saying that while she was trying to get out of Afghanistan, every time they spoke to the Taliban and checked identification, they were Pakistani identification cards, or that they were speaking in Urdu. So that's just one count of one story, a celebrity who's coming on TV and talking about it. So countless accounts of this, and what the people say on the ground, that the Taliban are not Afghan. That's what they believe.
Interesting.
If I can come in just 1 second, I think what's particularly damning is that, but you know, a lot of Western leaders are you know, quite rightly lamenting and condemning actions against Afghan women by the Taliban as they retreat, right? So there's a moment where you think, well, you can't have it both ways, right? If you can't at one point decide, well, for us, this is it, we're gone, that's enough. But what we're leaving behind is really, really terrible. And it seems like that it seems like the height of insincerity, and it's worse than insincerity. I can't find a polite word to say this, but to sort of decide that all of a sudden to start worrying about the plight of Afghan women now, I find staggering, really quite terrifying, and to a certain degree, sadly, reminds us so much of the opposite situation, where, you know, shortly in 2001, what did Laura Bush start? Laura Bush started talking about the plight of Afghan women, and the plight of Afghan women became the reason for, or at least one of the rationales put forward by the Bush administration for the invasion of Afghanistan. So again, we're coming round in these full circles that are full of pain and suffering, and are really hard to sort of separate from what is, as Hammasa was saying, what is actually happening on the ground.
Any other thoughts on that before we move on?
I suppose there's one thing to add, and again, it goes right back to the beginning in a sense. The 9/11 attacks were a huge shock to the US public, visceral, worse than Pearl Harbor in many ways. And this came at a time when the United States, under George Bush, had set up an administration which was going hell for leather for the new American century. And in a sense, this seemed to be knocking it off course. And this is why I think it was so almost certain that there would be a major conflict within Afghanistan. If Gore had got in, I think it would have been similar, but he wouldn't have gone into Iraq. But I think because of that public mood, people within the US right were far more able to, in a sense, phrase the Afghan operation as something which was bringing freedom to the country. But also there was a very strong element of increasing US influence in Central Asia and maintaining it as such. And certainly within a year or so, what became very clear after Bush's State of the Union address and the creation, or basically the idea of the axis of evil, was that if the United States succeeded in maintaining a degree of military control in Afghanistan and was able to do the same in Iraq, then the real problem for the United States, which had always been seen as Iran, not Afghanistan or Iraq, the real problem would be largely contained, because Iran itself would be contained, and it would basically it'd be surrounded by the Gulf states on the west, Afghanistan on the east, and then the Americans controlled the Arabian Sea and the Gulf. There was that was a much wider plan. There was sort of major geopolitics in this. And that in many ways, both in Afghanistan and Iran or Iraq, has gone terribly wrong. But the consequences for people, both in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere, have been utterly grievous. But we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that there wasn't much more to it than is normally stated.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go back to some of the other audience questions as well that came in. This is a question from Graham Ryan, who asked, why didn't the Americans and British have a contingency plans for the evacuation of personnel, including Afghans? And that goes to anyone.
Well, I'm going to say, I'll put this out there. I mean, if you look at how many Afghan civilians have been killed, then the loss of life that has taken place should give you an indicator of why those contingency plans weren't there. If we were genuinely concerned about the human rights of those people now at threat from the Taliban, then we'd allow more than 5,000 people in, on the scheme that we're allowing in this year, and 15,000 later on. We'd have a far more generous system. We wouldn't have spent years rejecting people's claims when they said that their lives were in danger now, not at some future point. Their lives were in danger there and then, and yet they were constantly rejected under the hostile environment of the government. So to then ask why they didn't have a program to be able to get these people out of the country for kind of makes sense when you look at it like that. I find it quite incredulous. I found it quite incredulous sat in Parliament that the human rights of the Afghan people were suddenly a concern, given the past 20 years, when they weren't, and, this is the horrible thing, and I will say this, but I know that the media will switch its attention very soon. When the pictures dry up at Kabul airport, as they no doubt soon will, their interest will wane, and they will switch attention elsewhere. And unfortunately, so will the British public. It will be another issue. It'll be Brexit or food shortages or something else. And I'm afraid, that's the reality of the very short attention span of our media establishment and also of our political class. So I guess that's why it's not. I don't think it's conspiracy. I think you just have to kind of follow the trail back to see that much of what's happening at the moment is. I'm not going to call it false. I think politicians in Parliament that stood up are genuinely concerned for the Afghan people. I just think it doesn't quite square with the policies that we've been pursuing pretty much unanimously across the House, well, across both mainstream political parties in the last 18 months. There you go.
I just wanted to add to that as Afghan people, we know what's happening. We could already see the narrative of the media changing slowly and bringing more COVID news or other news that will take the attention of the British public away from what's going on in Afghanistan. And that's when the Taliban will do what they're good at. That's when they'll show their true colors, because they also know that the world is watching them right now. So they're playing nice to an extent. This is them playing nice. So as Afghan people, this is what's our biggest fear, that the minute we're out of the media's eye, that's it. Afghanistan is vanished, it's done. Like our country, it's just being torn to pieces. We don't have a homeland anymore, and we know that. So that's another blow that's coming up for us.
I would add to that, I think it seems to be at a tangent, but it isn't. In the case of Britain, you have a government which appears to be hugely incompetent. If you look at the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, Britain actually had one of the world's best biosecurity strategies in theory. It was never implemented. And I rather suspect that essentially the government has its interests elsewhere. this one does. And on the scheme of things, its interest in getting out of Afghanistan, well, it thought that was more or less sorted back in 2015 when the troops were very largely withdrawn. The British stayed on, they were running the military academy and in some other things, but relatively small scale. And it had never really been high on the political agenda to recognize all the people who owed the British something and what was likely to happen if the Taliban came back. It simply wasn't there. And in many ways, the British, the Americans and others were caught out by the speed of the change of the last 3 or 4 weeks. And that doesn't give us any pleasure in saying it, but I think that also adds to it. And I don't actually think it's incompetence in many ways. And certainly, like Harmonie say, this isn't a matter of conspiracy. It's worse than that in many ways. It's deeply inbuilt in the political system.
I think we need to also, I mean, you know, I was reading the agreement between the US and the Taliban, which is called, by the way, the Agreement for Bringing Peace to Afghanistan. That is the title of the agreement, if you know. And so this is a negotiated withdrawal, right? It's a planned negotiated withdrawal. And so when Biden says, of course, we had to expect chaos, I don't quite understand how you can have a negotiated withdrawal pre-announced and then still say that, of course, there was going to be chaos. I find it difficult to bring the two together. And I think there is a certain amount of, there's a lot of responsibility, I would say, is that if you have a negotiated agreement, if you have planned this in advance, if you've known this for months, how do you all of a sudden find yourself quite in the situation that we are in now? And I can understand being sort of overcome by events, but I think there's a degree where this is not, this is not unexpected. We didn't not know that this was going to happen on the 31st of August. We knew this was going to happen on the 31st of August. It's planned, it's written. So I find that really quite difficult to get my head around, to be honest. I also find it, the point I'd like to make with regard to the people who are trying to leave Afghanistan is that now the new sort of way of framing it from the leadership of the UK and of the US is that anyone who wants to leave should be allowed to leave, which is very different from anyone who wants to come should be allowed to come. It's a completely different story, right? So they're saying, and in fact, the idea is leave by land. Therefore, you will go in third countries, and eventually you will go through the endless and most likely fruitless process of applying for asylum in the UK or in the US, right? So this is an incredible difference between anyone should be allowed to leave and anyone should be allowed to come. I think that's a really problematic change of way of formulating things.
Yeah, great point. Okay, I'm going to go back to other questions. So one audience member asked and has said, I've seen a lot of parallels made between this and the Vietnam War, but don't quite get why. Why is this the case? Any answers for this?
I think if I can just start, I think it's partly down to the graphics, the television graphics at the time. Basically, the sort of helter-skelter American withdrawal of the last minute from Saigon in particular was captured on television. The escape with the helicopter on the roof and people getting up a ladder to get into it, that became deeply embedded. It probably was not a true record of what was going on. It was just one event, but because of the televisual nature of it, it was taken out of all proportion. I think in many ways, the situations are very different. The Americans had a substantial number of troops in Vietnam until very nearly the end, and the collapse essentially came quite quickly. With Afghanistan, the numbers already been taken down a great deal. It was clear that the Americans and the British privately knew they could not win that war against the Taliban. And essentially they decided to get out. Curiously, it was a Trumpian decision to actually do it. But the significant was that Biden went along with it, partly because of domestic opinion in the United States, and partly because they did not see any way forward, given what had happened. The damage in many ways already been done hugely, and the Taliban did have the opportunity to come back in. So I think there is a difference, but because that was so striking, and you had sort of some parallels with the Chinooks taking people out from Kabul to the airport, then that I think is why you have this connection. But they were really very different.
Can I ask a question or I'll make a point? I mean, Paul, can you see a connection? I mean, it cannot be coincidence that the kind of defeat of Vietnam also ushered in the neoliberal era in many ways, the beginnings of it. And, you know, in a way that was, if you want, the kind of ruling elites in the West watching the student protests, the trade unions, the non-aligned nations of the world beginning to make more demands, growing in power, you know, big corporations, Western kind of capitalism, if you want, rather than democracy, had had a defeat against the Soviet Union, and they retrenched and came back in a way with a different system, which was it took the democratic control out of the UN, out of international relations, out of international institutions, out of domestic institutions, and handed it to you know, quasi-autonomous corporate structures, the discipline of the market, as Milton Friedman called it. And I'm just wondering now, when you look at Afghanistan, what lessons those people will now take from this defeat. You know, maybe I'm kind of clutching at straws here, but you know, I do think that the Vietnam War was in some way significant in the way that the West capital responded to the Soviet Union. They would argue that ultimately it was successful because, you know, 10, 15 years later, you had the rise of Thatcherism, Reaganism, and the ultimate defeat of the Soviet Union. They actually came back from that. I wonder what lessons, I'm sorry to use that term, lessons they will take from this defeat. And I don't think there'll be ones that I will, or many of the speakers here, will particularly like.
No, I have to agree with you on that. I mean, I think the more you look at it in terms of worldwide trends, you see that the transition to the neoliberal order in the 1980s is responsible for so much. But then if you have an ideological system which is based on the principle of having winners and losers, and if it turns out the losers are very large in number and some of the winners get extraordinary winnings, then eventually people recognize there's something seriously wrong. We're not at that stage yet. If anything, I think the stage we're at present is a move to a range of different populisms, often of the right. I would think in some ways that what has happened in the last 3 or 4 weeks, quite apart from the dreadful consequences for Afghanistan, makes it more likely that there will be a return to the Trumpian type view, not necessarily with Trump, in 2024. And so we're still in a very difficult time. If you look at the likes of Johnson, Modi, Bolsonaro and the West, we're not out of that by a long stretch. And in many ways, that is a very uncertain and varied response to the basic dynamic which we have. And people talk about us moving beyond the age of neoliberalism, we're into multi-stakeholderism and the rest. I don't buy that. I think the system itself is still there, and that has a much wider impact. And it's a system which obviously can't handle COVID and it can't handle climate breakdown.
I think neo-illiberalism may be a phrase.
Neo-illiberalism might be a more sensible thing, yes. Yeah, true. But I mean, that takes us off the immediate tragedy that we're seeing today, I'm afraid.
And so looking in the chat, there is a question from Gavin Beckett who asks, given that the Afghan army has melted away in the face of advance and withdrawal of the support of the US, I lost it. What is the realistic chance of a serious resistance to the Taliban?
Well, just as an outside view, I think it's unlikely. I don't see Western states potential supporters of such a resistance providing the sort of aid that would be required. And bluntly, it seems to me that the Taliban are pretty firmly in charge. The comment that was made about that, in fact, Hammasa made about, people, Taliban people showing Pakistani identity cards. The role of Pakistan in the growth and survival of the Taliban through primarily the ISI is basically a huge book still to be written. A fair bit's known about it, but there's a very heavy involvement there. So I think essentially the Taliban are relatively secure. One always has to remember that from a Pakistani army perspective, not from the political perspective necessarily, but the Pakistani army perspective, by far the greatest threat to Pakistan comes from India. the whole Hindutva ideology, if you like. And they are intent on having as much influence and control in Afghanistan as they can. It's a defense in depth. And there was very considerable anguish in Rawalpindi and even in Islamabad itself when you saw senior Afghan intelligence people spending time in New Delhi, where you saw India putting money into the Afghanistan legal system and the rest. And I'm afraid that you might call it great power politics or middle power politics, but that also has a role. And it's one of the reasons why it's a long-winded answer to your question. It's a long-winded answer why I think the Taliban are probably feeling more secure than we would ever like to admit.
I also, I'm sorry, from an international security perspective, I think my concern to a certain degree is that a lot, I mean, the US, the UK and other powers consider to a certain degree a Taliban regime controlling the whole of Afghanistan more stable. And as long as they don't bleed out, as long as they don't attack US and UK and French interests, well, to a certain degree, they will prefer that to an unstable Afghanistan in which potentially, I mean, you know, other factions can start taking over and creating for them from an international, well, I don't want to call it international security because it's not international security. It is security of certain Western states understood in very, very narrow terms. But they will see potentially a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan that is entirely controlled by the Taliban as a better solution, which is, it's a terrifying thought, but I think I'd want to put it out there.
Yeah.
I also wanted to add in regards to the Afghan army question that from what we know in Afghanistan, majority of the army and the soldiers had received orders to stand down, which is one of the reasons why the Taliban were able to take over so quickly. So they faced no resistance, and that's not because they ran away. That's because majority of them got told to stand down. And the second point I wanted to make is that the North, so the Northern Allegiance, are putting up a bit of a fight and resisting, and this is Panjshir Valley. So if majority of the Afghan soldiers that wanted to fight for Afghanistan but were told not to have now gone and joined the Northern Allegiance and are putting up some sort of resistance against the Taliban. And that's news straight from Afghanistan.
Could I ask you, Hammasa, why was the order to stand, well, who decided on issuing the order to stand down? And what appear to be the motives for doing that? Do we have any idea yet as to that, or will that be more likely to become visible in the future?
I think that's something, there is no, I can't really, this is just what I'm hearing from the people sharing the news from Afghanistan and from soldiers and people in the army that are reaching out and showing videos and pictures that are saying that they wanted to fight. There is videos that have been leaked where the commanders come and take their weapons away and ask them, and all the Afghan soldiers are crying and saying why we want to fight for our country. So there is some order has come from somewhere. Obviously our government had a part to play, no doubt, and a number of other Western and other neighboring countries had a part to play. So I don't know exactly where that order came from, but there is footage, and that's what the Afghan people majority are saying. And this is precisely why the ones that did want to fight have now gone up to the north. So I couldn't tell you exactly where that order came from, but that's like, if you look at events and timing, it makes sense that they were told not to fight.
There've been some indications that Hamid Karzai and also Abdullah have had meetings with Taliban leaders. Does that mean that they could have been implicated in this kind of thing, or what were their motives for doing this? Why is it that they are almost in a sense reaching out to the Taliban? Whether that reaching out is accepted or not, they do seem to be doing that or have done that. Can you throw any light on that? Because I find that I'm just not quite sure what the motivation is there.
I think they're trying to form some sort of a very fragile version of a coalition, and they're trying to fight for the people of Afghanistan, obviously, because our president that was in power left. So I think they're just there trying to figure out some sort of deal or bring some sort of just peace. So, I mean, peace is a far cry from with what's going on, but I think they're just trying to speak for the people of Afghanistan as representatives. I'm not quite sure because there isn't much that's coming out in regards to those meetings as far as I'm concerned, but from what I know, they're trying to speak to the Northern allegiance and speak to the Taliban and see if there is some sort of agreement somewhere.
Right. Thank you.
So I'll move on to the last few questions from the audience. We have one from Tom to whoever wants to answer this. Do you see a future where conversations about Western intervention become more humane and reflexive, and if so, how?
In a word, no, because the nature of warfare being conducted by the West and increasingly by other countries is very different from the past. We've moved into an era quite clearly much more towards remote warfare. You do not see major armed interventions with large numbers of troops on the ground. I think that is far less likely. What one is much more likely to see is the kind of war that was fought against ISIS between 2014 and 18. And that was a war almost entirely fought from the air, armed drones, strike aircraft and the rest. The use of 100,000 precision-guided bombs and missiles in the space of 4 years, killing of probably 60,000 plus people, ISIS and civilians, and essentially a belief initially that that worked. We now know that it hasn't worked, that ISIS is, in fact, on the move in a number of countries, but is that kind of model of warfare. So I've no doubt at all that what the French and the Americans have been doing across the Sahel region, what the Americans will do now in Afghanistan, if there is any kind of sign of ISIS-K and others active in a transnational way, you will see American intervention through drones and strike aircraft and standoff weapons, maybe a few special forces. It would be lovely to, well, lovely is a terrible word to use. It would be positive to think that the West is changing its ways. It is not. And the trouble is that other countries are following suit, whether it be Turkey, China, Russia, or others. We're moving into a different sort of warfare era, which is far less visible and far less accountable. And it's a huge problem, which I think we're only just beginning to recognize.
I think also that, I mean, I am slightly pessimistic about this, or I'm very pessimistic to a certain degree about this as well, in the sense that my concern is that there is a greater willingness of being very upfront on this is not in the interests of our country, full stop. End of story. It doesn't matter what are the implications for populations, for the international system, for for the UN, or it's just not in the interests of our country. End of story. And to a certain degree, there's part of me that thinks, well, at least it's said. At the same time, every time that is said, and every time a major state that used to be backing international norms, or at least claimed to be backing international norms, and therefore was slightly sort of stuck within that system, every time a major state says, sorry, doesn't matter now. I need to defend the interests of my country, and in the interest of my country, this is what we're doing. And I think every time that happens, international norms are weakened, and that is to a certain degree, I find more and more the case.
Can I just come in there? I mean, when we say in the interest of my country, from COVID to the climate crisis to the plight of the Afghan people now, you can begin to see that there is no such thing as national. There is a limited application to the term national self-interest. That the threats that face us are global, they're interconnected, and I really feel that in an ideal world, the nation state would not be the mechanism through which we made decisions, whether that's on COVAX, whether that's on COP26. It really feels to me that when countries all trying to kind of secure their own markets in this kind of hyper-capitalist system, all trying to secure their own resources, all trying to secure their own national interest, it becomes a scrum. And as the world is increasingly now globally interconnected, we can see that. The pandemic has just given us a massive slap in the face to show that. You begin to see that this whole notion of national self-interest cracks and is hollow. And actually, we are, what's in the interest of one needs to be made in the interest of all, or the vast majority of people on this planet. And that's simply not happening. And I'm afraid to say, I think the current geopolitical, economic infrastructure and system is completely incapable of delivering that. That's why I have such pessimism when it comes to COP26. You know, it's asking Boris Johnson and the Tories in so many ways to sort the climate crisis, to deal with it. It's like asking a tiger to become a vegetarian. You know, it can say it's going to become a vegetarian. It can try and become a vegetarian. It isn't going to become a vegetarian because it goes against its whole ethos of being. It's like the story of the scorpion, you know, and the mouse on its back, or the fox on its back, whatever. And it's in my nature. So I genuinely feel that this whole notion of national self-interest is rapidly waning, and the sooner we wake up to that, the better.
Thank you.
Sorry, can I come in just 1 second, because I'd like to ask Clive, do you feel it's waning as in it's waning, it should no longer be there? Do you think it's actually waning as in people are recognizing at the heights of power that this doesn't work anymore?
I think you look at the technology, you look at the globalization that's taken place over the last 50 years, the interconnectedness, the travel that takes place, the markets that are interconnected, the global food networks that are interconnected. You look at AI, computer networks. It just feels to me that we are now increasingly an interconnected organism, an international organism, in a way that we have never been before. And yet we're still using a kind of 18th, 17th century nation state approach, if you want. Sorry, they didn't exist, but the kind of 19th century nation state approach to dealing with a 21st century global society. And it's simply not fit for purpose. That's my view. Clearly, we are a long way from getting people. I mean, we just pulled out of the European Union in this country, for crying out loud. We're a long way from, where arguably they have a system of governance of nation states beginning to interact together in a way. It's not perfect, but interact in a way where they can begin to make collective decisions, Greece aside, they can begin to make collective decisions in the interests of the whole. Hopefully they've learned from the Greek experience and the financial meltdown that happened there and the way that Germany and others treated them. But I guess the key thing is, for me, is that the way that we have conducted ourselves in the past no longer seems fit for purpose in this century of all centuries, where we face those existential threats.
Thank you. We're going to have to wrap up in a moment. I just want to give the final word to Hammasa, because there were a lot of questions from people who asked what can they do to help the Afghan community right now? What are good acts of solidarity? And do you have any suggestions or advice?
I was going to say that it's very easy for all of us to sit here and debate and point fingers at various governments and play the blame game and look at the history and say, oh, we should have done this, we should have done that, we could have done this. At the moment, the only thing that I'm here for, or that I wanted to come and speak about, is to help the people. We need to concentrate on the human side of this and look at all the children that are paying the price, all the trauma that our people getting put through, what our people are paying the price for, these political games that the West wants to play with our countries. We've had enough of that. We've had 40 years of war. We're tired, we're exhausted. We get born into war and we die into war. My grandmother has been affected by the war. My mother has been affected by the war. I'm affected by the war. My children will be affected by the war. When is enough is enough? Like, when are these people gonna just take a step back and look at the human cost of these issues? So my advice to you guys would be, whoever wants to help, please put pressure on your MPs to try and get more people into the UK. 5,000 in the first year is not enough. The damage that these countries and the armies have caused, 5,000 people is not enough people. We need to not only try and get people out, because that's not the only solution. You cannot take millions of people out from their home country. Some people don't want to leave. So we need to try and find a solution to pressure the Taliban, put leverage and financial and media, whichever way we can, to try and bring some human rights into play in Afghanistan. So I'd say, please, as much as you can, donate, raise awareness, talk about it, because we know the media will stop very soon. And we know that it's going to be the people paying the price for that as well. So I'd say that we just need to try and as a collective consciousness of the world, we need to come together and look at the human cost of this and try and put some sort of pressure or leverage on the Taliban to try and make living conditions a little bit better for the people of Afghanistan, instead of sitting and trying to play the blame game. That's not going to help the people who need it the most right now.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm really sorry, but we do have to wrap up now. Sorry that I didn't get through everyone's questions, but thank you so much, everyone, for joining us in this debate. And thanks to all our panelists. So we do have a weekly discussion, and you can check out our website and our social media to check out for more details, and go to that's opendemocracy.net. And my colleague will probably put some links in the chat to our newsletter and so on. And finally, before I end, Open Democracy relies on contributions and donations. So if you want to see more public interest journalism like this, please do consider supporting Open Democracy. And thank you all again, and hopefully see you next week.